Do not go gentle into that good night was undoubtedly, at least for me, the best poem Dylan Thomas ever wrote. Now, I say that because, first of all, I loved every word of it, but because it was also very tightly controlled, and we're going to talk about the villanelle in just a second, but also because it has entered popular culture. Funerals use it more often than "And Death Has No Dominion." And now, as we roll through the 21st century, movies are starting to get the same feel for this poetry. Now, we're going to use one of those movies, Interstellar, which is combining great visuals with great words. So now, let's leave "And Death Shall Have No Dominion" and move on and hear the very first stanza.
Amelia, be safe. Give my regards to Dr. Mann.
I will, Dad.
It looks good for your trajectory. We've calculated 2 years to Saturn.
It's a lot of Dramamine.
Look after my family, will you please, sir?
We'll be waiting for you when you get back. Little older, a little wiser, but happy to see you. Do not go gentle into that good night. Old age should burn and rave at close of day. Rage, rage against the dying of the light.
Do not go gentle into that good night. Old age should burn and rave at close of day. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. That's an amazing first stanza, made even more important because this poem is a villanelle. If you get the first stanza correct in a villanelle, you have already written something like 1/3 of the poem itself. Now, as a literary vehicle, it's highly complex. Invented by the French, of course, but used mostly in that country for troubadour songs or things like that. But in England, Dylan Thomas took that genre, that poetic vehicle, and turned it into something very special because his first stanza was absolutely magnificent. Now, as you can see, if you look at the page that's now flashing on the screen, the two main lines, do not go gentle into that good night. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. Both of those lines are repeated 4 times. It's something that Dylan Thomas loved. He did it with "And Death Shall Have No Dominion" 6 times. Here, 4 and 4. Because he wanted to dig a trench in our minds with the one line that he wanted us to remember. And it's true. I may forget some of the other lines, but I remember these 2 lines very, very well. Okay, I mentioned earlier that this poem was a villanelle. Basically 19 lines, 5 of them, 3 stanzas each, the 6th one, 4 stanzas, 4 lines, iambic pentameter, repetition of certain lines in certain places. I'm not going to talk about the gruesome details of this literary form, but there's something that I do want to say. For most poets, it would be a terrible straitjacket. Just the constraints that it puts on your imagination would leave most wordsmith sputtering without a syllable to say. But for Dylan Thomas, he was such a high-octane sort of guy, it simply brought him down to earth. Because, quite frankly, having read some of his other poems, his lyricism does tend to get out of hand at times. He needed a form that said, make it brief, make it tight, make it concise. It was the making of Dylan Thomas because he had to corral the excesses that were part of his life when it came to drinking, women, or poetry, and turn it into something that now resonates as one of the great poems of the 20th century. Okay, now, Dylan Thomas has been linked to the Romantic movement. Now, please don't get the nomenclature wrong. Romantic movement had nothing to do with late night orgies. It had everything to do with being spontaneous, being in love with nature, being natural, and kind of a reaction to the industrialization that was taking place in England during the time of Tennyson and Wordsworth and Blake. Now, yes, Dylan was all those things, but I have a difficult time reconciling the vast opus of the Romantic poets with the far different style and content that Dylan Thomas gave us, except, of course, when he was writing about nature, and which he often did because he came from Swansea. And Swansea was pretty farmish, okay? But when he was writing his great poems, he was touching something, I think, far deeper than the Romantic poets. Because, okay, this is a prejudice I have on my part, because I learned when I was in junior high school a poem called Daffodils. I wandered lonely as a cloud that floats on high o'er vales and hills, when all at once I saw a cloud, a host of golden daffodils. Now, I think Wordsworth was probably, to give him his due, was probably a better poet than Dylan Thomas. But when it comes to gut-wrenching lyricism, Thomas had it with words that we're going to hear now from, once again, Interstellar. You're going to see and listen to the second stanza of Do Not Go Gentle Into That Good Night.
Though wise men at their end, no dark is right, because their words had forked no lightning they. Do not go gentle into that good night. Rage, rage against the dying of the light.
Now, I'm going to give you credit for being a fairly literary person if you're watching this video. So no need for me to recite every death metaphor. Good night, dying of the light, or whatever. You know, they're there, but let's assume, I'm assuming you know them. But here's the thing about this particular stanza. The first stanza set off the theme. Now we're getting into the specifics. He's like the argument. The first stanza set out the argument. Do not go gentle into that good night. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. Now that could have been, as we initially assumed, a message for Dylan Thomas's father. We're going to examine that more closely. But now we're going to look and take that theme and give 4 different examples. And the first one is wise men. Wise men, because they should not go gentle into that good night, because their words have forked no lightning. Now, everybody has their favorite stanza. I think maybe this one is mine. Why? Because it's the best written? No. Because I see myself as a wise man. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not claiming guru qualities. Wise men, I think, would probably fit Dylan Thomas's father, who was a wise man. He was a top scholar who didn't do very well at a job, in his career. But I also feel that way. I mean, basically, has my words, I taught high school, and I don't even want to name some of the people I taught high school to, but did my words fork any lightning? I have to jump to that conclusion, having met them later in life, that perhaps not, perhaps yes. But anyway, I took this particular stanza to be talking to me directly. So, yes, wise men. They want to stay back, give it another try, because their golden words forked no great aurora borealis.
Good men the last wave by, crying how bright their frail deeds might have danced in a green bay. Rage, rage against the dying of the light.
Good men, their last wave by. Now, we have been talking about death metaphors. Now, this I don't think is a death metaphor. I think it's the last hurrah, the ultimate, penultimate moment before people start to go into that sort of deathbed scene. Now, but as they said here, they cry because their frail deeds have danced in a green bay. Now, I don't like this particular stanza on a content level. I think it's totally brilliant on a literary level. But what basically you've got here is a bunch of old whiners saying, I could have done really great stuff if, the things would have been better off. My misfortunes have nothing to do with me. My frail deeds could have danced in a green bay. A green bay meaning a world where opportunities were growing everywhere, like vegetation. Now, green bay has been used frequently. F. Scott Fitzgerald used it in Gatsby when he had a green light across the bay, talking about how Gatsby grabbed onto the American dream or failed to grab onto the American dream. But it's got that same quality that people don't achieve what they want to achieve, not because they are limited as human beings, as we all are, but not because of their limitations, their shortcomings, their failings, but because for some reason the world has not quite treated them right. I have only one word to say about that. Crap.
Wild men who caught and sang the sun in flight, and learned too late they grieved it on its way. Do not go gentle into that good night.
Okay, wild men who caught and sang the sun in flight, and learned too late they grieved it on its way. very lyrical, but very beautiful. It captures a man, type of man that Dylan knew very well, himself. He was the wild man of English literature in the 20th century. But though he caught the sun like Icarus, the man who flew to the Greek god who flew too close to the sun, he ended up having his wings burned. Now, there is no doubt in my mind that he was an alcoholic. But I have to say from my own reading that perhaps alcohol and Dylan Thomas were more friends than enemies. Yes, it probably contributed to his death. He boasted just before he had died that he had drunk 38 stingers, and he made the ridiculous remark, that's probably a record. But Dylan Thomas was also the genius poet. He did not go out with a notebook in his pocket, see something, a beautiful rainbow, and then scribble for 5 minutes about the beautiful rainbow. He worked hard. He took his brain to the edge of the abyss, and then he shoved it off. I think good ale was what kept Dylan Thomas on this planet for as long as it was, and he stayed with us for 39 glorious years.
Grave men near death, who see with blinding sight, blind eyes could blaze like meteors and be gay, rage, rage against the dying of the light.
Grave men near death, who see with blinding sight, blind eyes could blaze like meteors and be gay. Once again, thank you, Interstellar, for giving us both the visuals and the words. But I am not in love with this particular stanza. I don't think it's as powerful as the last one. But I grant Dylan Thomas the right to write it simply because he had no choice. If I was to edit his poem, I would cut this one out. The idea, it's a bit lyrical, but with no real meaning. Of course, as you probably well know, gay is a word that has become part of the English language as a homosexual only within the last 30 or 40 years. Certainly in 1950, when Dylan Thomas wrote this poem, it just meant lively, ebullient, feisty, whatever. Okay, so now we're talking now about the last of the four characters, grave men. Now, some people have said, oh, this is a pun on the word grave. Some of you probably remember Romeo and Juliet, when Mercurio, who had just been stabbed by a poisoned dagger, said, if you do not see me tomorrow, you will find me a grave man. Tomorrow you will find me a grave man. Now, that was not a particularly good pun on the part of Shakespeare. I don't think Dylan Thomas meant it that way. I think he just meant grave men, serious men, guys who don't laugh a lot. And so I'm not going to say that. But to me, it just didn't catch fire. But luckily, the sixth stanza, which we are just about to hear, was probably the very best. And it brings it back to a point I've tried to make before. Dylan Thomas was an artist, not a historian. When he positions himself talking to his father, supposedly his dying father, don't take that as seriously as the idea that artists, great artists, will do whatever they have to do to make a highly dramatic point.
And you, my father, there on the sad height, curse, bless me now with your fierce tears, I pray. Do not go gentle into that good night. Rage, rage against the dying of the light.
Okay, we have done what I always feel we should do when we're looking at poetry. We have gone stanza by stanza, if not line by line through it, to get a sense of what it means in everyday language. Now, we're going to finish with one stanza. This is the sixth stanza. It is the last one, and I think the most powerful one of all. And you, my father, there on that sad height, curse, bless me, now with your fierce tears, I pray. And then we have the last two lines that have become the hallmarks, the signatures of this poem. But I want to talk a little bit about this addressing his father. I've kept it to the very end, to this point, to refute what I think is a misunderstanding. I've hinted that his father was not the subject of this poem. Death was the subject of the poem, just as "and death shall have no dominion" was the subject of the poem. But unlike death, this one grabbed us emotionally in the guts because it seemed like he was talking to his real father. Dylan understood that. I said earlier, poets are artists, not historians. Well, the history of his father, his father died 5 years after this poem was written. Dylan wrote it in Florence on a holiday. His father died 5 years later. Well, okay, you say, oh, maybe he was sick for 5. He wasn't sick for 5 years. Plus, he was a staunch non-believer in Christianity. He would not been willing to bless or curse Dylan. He knew the end was the end. Now, Dylan Thomas is changing. This whole last stanza is said with a different intonation. Now, Dylan couldn't quite get it himself because his voice was always a deep baritone, but Richard Burton could, and we're going to hear from Richard Burton in just a second. But Richard Burton, through the intonation of his voice, sad height, curse, bless, curse or bless. Now, it's no longer a son ordering his poor dad to get himself up to, fight it, Dad, fight it, Dad. This is a much more realistic.
Do not go gentle into that good night. Old age should burn and rave at close of day. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. Though wise men at their end know dark is right, because their words had forked no lightning, they do not go gentle into that good night. Good men the last wave by, crying how bright their frail deeds might have danced in a green bay. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. Wild men who caught and sang the sun in flight, and learned too late they grieved it on its way. Do not go gentle into that good night. Grave men near death who see with blinding sight, blind eyes could blaze like meteors and be gay. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. And you, my father, there on the sad height. Curse, bless me now with your fierce tears, I pray. Do not go gentle into that good night. Rage, rage against the dying of the light.
My father, there on that sad height, curse, bless me now with your fierce tears, I pray. The last two lines of this four-line stanza are the repeated words of the title. Now, this, when you have the last stanza, it has to be climactic. Briefly, why I picked this particular poem, not only over his other poem, And Death Shall Have No Dominion, but over a host of other poems, modern poems, that are excellent. It's because I think, partly because of my age, partly because I didn't see him talking directly to his father. I saw him talking to all of us. Dylan Thomas was talking to all of us. His father was our representative. His father did not die for another 5 years after the poem. Dylan Thomas died 11 months later in a very sad situation, which confirms, by the way, his alcoholism and his craziness, because nowhere do you get to be a crazy poet with more credence than in America. The academics fell at his feet, and the ladies of America fell elsewhere. Okay, but now I don't believe Dylan Thomas, who wrote this when he was 30, was writing to his father. Now, why? I've kind of talked about it. His dad was an atheist, etc., etc. But I think he did it because, and I honestly believe this, Dylan Thomas loved the idea of sacrificing everything. And many poets and writers do this. They will twist the truth to make a good story. And we're seeing that in television today. Everything is twisted to make a good story. But he did that. He knew in his heart that if he addressed this to his father, he would end on a very, very high note. And he did. For those people who still believe it's to his father, I'll just say this one thing: you're wrong. But I also would like to finish by saying this. Dylan Thomas's father was, if not a failed poet, a very unheralded poet. His words fork no lightning. But I say, and I say this, he should be proud, because his son, his prodigal son, his bohemian son, his boorish son, wrote words that forked a great deal of lightning.